Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 5. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your main host for this episode, and joining me on the line, just one cool guy with us this time. It's Teld here to talk about Peasant Cube with us. Mr. Christopher Sofsky has abandoned us to live his best life in, I want to say, Turkey, of all places. You know, power to him. I wish I could travel more. I'm happy he's out traveling, but he's going to be living his turkey life over the course of the next couple weeks. So I believe this episode and the following episode that we do will just be me and Teld. And that means, when the boss is away, the boys will play. We get to talk about some peasant content here, which I'm excited to talk about.
Yeah, I am too. Chris would probably be a little more grouchy about this topic, so it's kind of nice to, get to talk about it. I was going to suggest we'd send him to a nice sanctuary upstate. He was going to be living his best life in a free open field.
Yeah, it's time to retire, Chris. It's time to go. You guys actually, the very first episode of kind of the revamped podcast was just you and Chris, and you guys did talk about the Peasant Cube, right? I think you guys talked about just general Peasant Cube construction.
Yeah, I believe that episode was more related to like design choices and like how to construct a Peasant Cube. What are some things to think about, that sort of thing. Which isn't exactly what we're going to be talking about today.
No, we're talking about the actual Jank Diver Gaming Peasant Cube, which, to Chris's credit, me and Chris kind of built this from the ground up. The Peasant Cube is actually the basis for Jank Diver Gaming as a whole. We'll go over a little history with it and everything, but just know that it came out during COVID times when everybody was stuck at home and kind of helped kickstart the Jank Diver Gaming community, and Peasant Cube was basically all we did at the time. I know we focus on unrestricted cube when we're talking about cube in general on the podcast, but things have kind of shifted with Jank Diver Gaming, where the unrestricted cube is now the more popular cube, and the Peasant Cube, which was really all we offered for about 2 years, has kind of taken a little bit of a back burner. I think there's less of an audience for it in our particular group than there used to be. But you and I, Teld, love the Peasant Cube, and we're going to take the opportunity to talk about it. Chris is so mentally focused on the unrestricted cube. He's had a taste of blood. He's gotten a rare in his hands, and it's tainted him. So he's really an unrestricted cube junkie. That's where a lot of his focus goes these days.
We stuck Beanstalk Giant into the cube, and he still hasn't noticed, I don't think. So we're doing pretty good there.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I love the Peasant Cube as well. People in our environment are a little too happy to have one cards win the game, but the Peasant Cube, you got to have your cards work together. So
yeah, unrestricted has its merit, but Peasant, man, it's not even, Peasant Cube. The whole impetus, or at least I think the stigma around it, is that it's just powered down cube, but look at the power level of commons and uncommons in sets these days, and look at how many of them are in our Peasant Cube, and it's just wild. Like you literally have cards from the unrestricted cube making the Peasant list, at common or uncommon. But
yeah, I think what I would describe it as is like cube is kind of like you want to build a bad constructed deck, like regular cube, and the Peasant Cube is what if we took all of the sweetest limited cards of all time and made our own retail limited set.
Yeah, it's a completely different set. It's funny too, when we first made the Peasant Cube, Chris was the one who was very adamant about like, I want to build an environment where you don't lose to like this bomb rare or whatever. That was kind of the whole thing. And then things developed over time. People were like, well, what if we played with rares? And I was like, well, yeah, what if we played with rares? And boom, unrestricted cube happened, and that kind of kicked off in popularity, which is fine. I do like the unrestricted cube as well. I'm not knocking that, but that is kind of the design focus these days. But we're going to talk about Peasant. We're going to do it. Before we get into that, I do want to say you can find our Discord group, the Jank Diver Gaming Discord, wherever you're listening to this podcast. And that is where you can join up and actually play with us. It is completely free. You do have to have some wild cards, which we'll talk about. But you can find our Discord where we set up our drafts on Sundays and set up our drafts on Wednesdays. The Peasant Cube happens on Wednesdays at 7:30 Eastern. And occasionally during that slot, we'll test out different types of cubes. But we would love if some people came in and started testing the Peasant Cube with us. We've made a lot of changes, and we haven't had as many hands on it as we would like. So that's kind of the impetus for doing this whole episode, is to talk up how good the Peasant Cube is, because I think it's just an awesome environment, and it's undergone a lot of change, which we'll talk about here.
Yeah, and if you're one of those people who's a little concerned about, Muldrifter Tribal being what Peasant's about, because that's been the kind of stigma around it, I will tell you the last couple of weeks, like these aggressive mid-range decks have been doing super well. You know, our finals last week was Naya tokens versus like a black-white aggressively slanted mid-range deck. And then this week it was, I believe, blue-white tempo versus red-white aggro.
Yeah. The red-white actually got a huge bump in Wilds of Eldraine from a couple different cards. So the tables may be turning in favor of Boros now, which we'll talk about the kind of historically best decks. And Boros has not been one of the historically best decks. For what it's worth, if you are able to access cubecobra.com, the list that we are talking about here today will be on cubecobra.com, and you can look up the link wherever you're listening to this podcast. So that's the name of the game. We're going to talk about the logistics of the Peasant Cube. We're going to talk about the design approach, and we're going to spend the majority of the time talking about the actual themes, the 2-color pairs and stuff like that, and then some general notes if you do come draft with us, maybe some tips that Teld and I have to help you get started if maybe you're not a big cuber, especially since we do all of our cubing on Arena. So let's get into the logistics of everything here. This is a historic cube. That's just a fancy way of saying it uses the Arena card pool. So if you want to call this an Arena cube, go ahead. That means we are limited to what's on Arena. Some of the all-time Peasant cards, if you look at people's paper Peasant cubes, you'll see cards like Skullclamp, Pestilence, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Sylvan Library is a Peasant legal card.
Yeah, Swords to Plowshares, stuff like that.
Yeah, Swords to Plowshares, which technically is on the client. We'll talk about why we don't play it. So, you know, these power outlier cards, I don't think... the thing about them is, yes, they're power outlier cards that we don't have access to, but I don't think we would want to play them anyway, even if we did have access to them.
Yeah, I think if you're going to include these cards, Chris and I talked about why we're pretty not into it in the last Peasant episode. But I think if you're really into just power maxing, you're already playing cards that enable combos on your, you know, you're probably playing some sort of persist combo or like the Scurry Oak Splinter Twin combo or something like that. And I think these cards become a lot less egregious when you've got decks that can just win on the spot. But yeah, in our environment, we definitely try to have a much more like traditional retail limited feel where you're not just combo killing your opponent. Like you might have some really, really synergistic plays, but nothing that's just going to like straight up win the game like that.
Yeah, and we try to focus on balance in all of our cubes. We think it's very important that any given color pair or any given theme that you add to the cube is just as viable or at least possible to 3-0 with as anything else. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to put like Pestilence in a cube of our power level, even if we could, because it's just going to make whatever deck gets Pestilence the best deck at the table. You know, there's a bunch of uncommons out there that have no business being uncommons, and I always scratch my head when people add them to their own Peasant lists. But Peasant lists at broad, like legacy Peasant lists, are way more powerful than what we're working with. Although we do have some good, powerful cards in our cube.
The good news is even if we do see Skullclamp and Sylvan Library on the client, we're not going to see them in uncommon, right?
No.
We might. Yeah, I don't know if Pestilence is the kind of card that they'll be able to squeeze into an actual set at common or uncommon either. It just doesn't feel like the kind of way that they print cards anymore. Honestly, I think that's for the best. I like playing like Pauper and Artisan and stuff on the client as well, just these lower rarity formats. And one of the distinct differences between playing Legacy Pauper, like on Moto or MTGO, is that you don't have these like Pestilence kind of power outliers that just completely invalidate large segments of the card pool.
I could definitely see them just throwing Skullclamp at Mythic Rare on a bonus sheet, and I wouldn't complain about it. We would probably play it in the unrestricted cube and be happy about it, but definitely wouldn't put that card in Peasant cube. And since it would be printed at Mythic Rare, we really wouldn't anyway. There's a wild card thing that we'll talk about here in just a second, but just to wrap up framing the card pool we're talking about, it's basically a 360 card cube, but we do have a 450 card version. But the 450 version has more redundancy, more of like basically the same effect so that you're making sure you're opening up key effects during the draft. And it's also the playground where we test out cards that we didn't want to make room for in 360, but we're intrigued about. And then last little note about our environment in particular, which throws people off a little bit when they draft with us, is that we do have rare lands in the cube, despite, you know, having an uncommon and below restriction. We find that things like shock lands and just good dual lands make for better gameplay. And most people who play on Arena already have a lot of the lands. So people don't really have to invest a lot into the lands. And using rare lands over a bunch of tap lands does let things like Boros thrive, you know, whereas Boros takes a huge hit if you're just playing a bunch of tap lands. So we do have rare lands, but we also allow people to substitute them out for like common lands if the wild cards end up being an issue.
Yeah, the short of it would be that these rare lands enable aggro much more than control. If you're playing in a traditional all-tap land Peasant cube, the big 5-color decks are just going to take up all those Boros lands because the red-white deck the aggressive decks can't actually afford to play them. So by playing these rare lands, your aggressive decks actually can have reasonable enough mana to play a 2-color aggro deck. And on top of that, it makes your lands just generally like a tier or two higher as picks, which makes the draft segment more interesting because there's actual more decisions to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to discuss something here that I keep calling the Polaka Worm dynamic. If you've ever played in a Peasant environment, or maybe you've played like actual Peasant constructed or something, I think Arena calls this Artisan, right?
Yes. For Arena purposes, Arena, Peasant and Artisan are the same.
Yeah, and that basically means you can use only commons and uncommons, but the rule is you're allowed to use any card that has ever been printed at common or uncommon, even if like the most recent reprinted was bumped up to rare or something like that. We don't necessarily adhere to that rule. We only abide by whatever rarities are currently on Arena, and I call it the Polaka Worm dynamic because Polaka Worm only exists at rare on Arena, despite being an uncommon in, I think, every other printing in paper. So if you're playing an Artisan cube or a Arena cube or whatever, a historic cube in paper, you can technically put Polaka Worm in there, even if it has a rare symbol on it, and you're adhering to the restrictions of, Peasant. But we don't do that for a couple reasons. A, we do technically have a wild card restriction. That's a barrier to entry for some people, so we don't want people to have to craft rare cards, even though technically they're commons or uncommons, B, I feel like the Arena card pool is very in sync as far as the power level and the sets that go. So it feels to me like Polaka Worm deserves to be a rare, So we're going to treat it as a rare.
Yeah, I doubt we would see this card in a standard retail limited set at uncommon again. It's a bit of a ballbuster. Like we see the Lindworm, Honey Mammoth style cards, and like Polaka Worm is just way better than any of those. Yeah,
and if you look at the environments where Polaka Worm first existed, it was printed in Rise of the Eldrazi, right? Which was a set that lended itself to huge creatures at uncommon and stuff like that. And then I think it was in Conspiracy, which is a multiplayer thing, and then you see it in master sets, and it's always uncommon. But then it was in a core set at rare, and everybody was like, why was this upshifted to rare? And it's like, well, why don't you play with this card at uncommon in a core set? And that'll answer your question. But we do adhere to whatever the rarities are. There are some casualties of that, though. Sometimes Wizards likes to be cheeky, and they like to put a rare symbol on cards that have no business having a rare symbol on them, and that does restrict our ability to play it in our cube, at least by our own philosophies. So I'm thinking mostly the cards like the mystical archive cards like Ephemerate or Abundant Harvest or even Sign in Blood. These are rares on Arena, even though they're like commons in paper. And we just don't want to charge people a bunch of wild cards for stuff like that. So we just restrict them until we get a common printed on Arena.
Yeah, I think Abundant Harvest and Sign in Blood are kind of egregious. Though I will say I think Ephemerate just should not have been at common or uncommon. I think that card is a little silly in lower rarities. Abundant Harvest was straight up a troll move, though. Like, why was that card not an uncommon in the Mystical Archives?
Who knows? Yeah, it makes no sense, but it is a barrier to entry. We want to make sure that the Peasant Cube stays accessible to people, and we don't want wild cards to bog people down. So we do restrict things to things that are actually common and uncommon. Another quick casualty of this is that we don't get to play with cards that are recently downshifted in rarity and paper. So, for instance, if you go look at Commander Masters, there are like 50 cards on the Arena client that were downshifted to uncommon, but we only have access to them as a rare. So our Rishkars and our Gore Claws and God knows whatever else they downshifted to uncommon, we still don't add those to our Peasant Cube, even though they're technically Peasant legal at large.
Dear Watsy, please give us Poor's Gonti at uncommon. Thank you.
Yeah, Gonti, oh man, they downshifted Gonti to uncommon, which is just, come on, what a beautiful card. People love playing Gonti, like, might be the perfect Magic card, but we still have a rare symbol on it, and we're not charging people rare wild cards to play the Peasant Cube. So that's an unfortunate part of only playing through Arena, but all the advantages make up for it, so it's fine. Talk to me about combo. We do not play Splinter Twin-esque combos in this cube, although over the course of the last, 3 months, we've gotten access to multiple Peasant-level Splinter Twin combos for some reason.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there are exactly 3 combos on the Arena client at Peasant. There could be more, but the 3 that I'm aware of are the +1/+1 Unicorn or Renata plus the Persist Goblin. You can do that with a sack outlet and a Blood Artist, and you can instant kill your opponent. There's the Rosy Cotton Scurry Oak combo, where Rosy Cotton enters play and puts a +1 counter on a thing because it makes a food token. Anytime a token enters play, you put a counter on a thing. And then Scurry Oak, it has evolved, so it gets a +1 counter when a bigger creature enters play. And when it gets a +1 counter, you make a squirrel token. And so you make a food, you put the counter on the Scurry Oak makes a token, Rosy triggers, puts a counter on the Scurry Oak, and you do that until you have a gigantic board and a gigantic Scurry Oak. And then the other one is one out of this newest set. I'm actually surprised they took the stopgap off this one, but Experimental Confectioner is 4 mana for a 2/3 ETB, makes a food. And when you sacrifice a food, you get a 1/1 rat token. That combos with Peregrine Took, that when a token ETBs, you get a food. And you can sack 3 foods to draw a card. You have to get a 3rd food token from somewhere, but it's pretty easy with Peregrine Took. And then you sack the 3 foods, which puts 3 Confectioner triggers on the stack, because it's not when 1 or more tokens is sacrificed. It triggers individually. And so you get 3 rat tokens, which then triggers Peregrine Took 3 times, gives you 3 food tokens that you can then sack to get, draw a card, get 3 rat tokens, get 3 food tokens, and repeat until you've drawn your entire deck.
Yeah, so what's the problem with playing these? Because first off, they are A plus B combos, right? You're playing a 360 cube. Even in a 450 cube, they might not come together. The problem for me is that these cards are all kind of individually good. Rosy Cotton's a good card, Scurry Oak's a good card, but what's the problem with having Rosy Cotton plus Scurry? I guess explain to the people why we're just not interested in having these A plus B combos in this cube.
The big problem is that it breaks kind of the fundamental rules of Retail Limited, which is that there aren't combos, right? When you play Retail Limited, you might have really synergistic decks, but you're not just straight up combo killing your opponent. And part of this is trying to limit that. We don't like combo here as a general rule. Our unrestricted cube, we specifically avoid combos as well. And it just isn't fun, right? Some of these you can play on the same turn and you just have no room for interaction, but they all just demand immediately a removal spell at instant speed. They kind of put you in that Splinter Twin bind of if your opponent plays a Scurry Oak and Rosy Cotton is in the cube, you have to respect the fact that your opponent can have that combo for the rest of the game and ties up your mana and your removal. And on top of that, this isn't constructed where you can put as many removal spells in your deck as you want. Sometimes when you're drafting, you only have a couple of removal spells in your deck. And some of these green mid-range decks, you might only have one instant speed way to interact with your opponent. So it just creates a really feels bad gameplay. It'd be fun the first time or two that happened when you're on the side casting it, and it'd feel miserable on the other side. But eventually, people are going to recognize that, and eventually occasionally you'll get the combo, and that's not fun, or people are just going to be tired of playing it. It isn't enjoyable, right? There's not the power level of interaction to counter these sort of A plus B combos. They're just, it aren't the tools available at this rarity to deal with these.
Yeah, and it's not like they're unstoppable combos, right? You do a board wipe or something, and that usually resets a lot of what these combos are doing. And they're not instant wins either. They usually have to carry over to the next turn to attack with your infinite army of squirrels or rats or whatever. My personal thing is I don't mind combo existing in cube, but if you're gonna put combo in your cube, literal A plus B combo, I win the game, then it needs to be, I think, just a feature of your cube. I don't think you just want one random combo in your cube or 2 random combos in your cube. It doesn't make sense to me when you're playing something like a modern cube and Splinter Twin combo is there, but that's the only combo, because then you just have one deck at the table that's operating on a completely different axis than what everybody else, it's kind of breaking the rules of engagement almost. It's there's a deck floating around at this table that you might get paired up against that's doing something fundamentally different than what the rest of the cube is designed to do. And I think if there's more combo, if there's a focus on it, in, say, Vintage Cube, that's okay. That's something you can build into it, but not something we want here. We don't want people to play a fun, engaging game and then they get randomly paired against the person who has Rosy Cotton Scurry Oak and they lose on the spot because they just weren't prepared to deal with combo. It's not something we want as a 1-off or 2-off. And since it's not a huge feature of the cube and there aren't that many combos in Peasant arena cubes in general. We just decide to make sure these cards don't come together in our environment at all. Couple final notes before we start talking about actual 2-color pairs here. We do have access to alchemy cards. That's actually, some people might call it what you want. I know I'm using the A word here, the alchemy word, but that is an advantage to the arena card pool, is that there are cards that you can't play in paper. I'm not telling anybody to go out there and play alchemy cards, because some of them are absolutely egregious.
Most of them, actually.
Yeah, about 95% of them are really just hyper powerful cards that have no business existing at all. So we fielded out a ton of alchemy cards, and while they were available to us on the client, we actually only play 2 of them at this point, and one of them is Mana Fix and Land. So the other one's Dragonfly Pilot, which is a completely inoffensive card. But I do think there are alchemy cards that have some play to them in the arena card pool, but just know that if you come join up with us, you might see an alchemy card or two.
Forsaken Crossroads is one of those cards that I honestly wish they would just print this design into paper. They don't want to do it because of memory issues of remembering who goes first, but this is the most inoffensive design I can think of, and it's also a rare example of a card that doesn't reward you for being on the play, and I wish we had more of that in Magic, because right now being on the play is a huge advantage.
Yeah, it's actually something I think Alchemy does well, and I'm not going to get into Alchemy design here, but there's actually a handful of cards that are better or get some sort of advantage if you were on the draw. And I think that's a really nice design space for Alchemy. The problem with doing that in paper, of course, is the memory issue of, oh, wait, it's turn 8, who played first this game? That sort of thing, which you don't think is going to be a problem until it actually is turn 8, and you have to think about who played first, and it's not clear. So Forsaken Crossroads, just for reference, is like a multicolor land. It's like an Uncharted Haven, right? You pick the color that it's going to tap for when it enters the battlefield, but you can untap it if you weren't the starting player. So it's just a good mana fixer.
If you choose to not untap it, or if you're on the play, it also has the temple text where you get to scry one, and that's also just a nice little upside. It's just a really inoffensive, sweet little fixing land.
One more thing to address here, and you mentioned this at the top of the episode, and I want to talk a little bit about our approach to it, is the Mold Drifter issue, right? The idea that all peasant cubes are just piles of 2-for-1 creatures that give you value, and everybody's just going to be playing an outvalue game. Everyone's going to go to turn 12, and you're going to have board stalls because everything's just a 2-for-1, and you can't leverage anything against your opponent. Can you talk to me a little bit about that, and how do we try to avoid this Mold Drifter issue, if you even consider it an issue?
I've said numerous times my favorite decks to draft in this environment are kind of the green mid-range decks, right? And they are the Mold Drifter decks. You're playing Cyril's Packmates and Atsakan Archer and Ferrisbane Brawler and all these cards that either generate card advantage when they interplay, or they fight something. They do something as an ETB trigger on top of just being a regular creature. Now, that being said, while I think these are really powerful, there's a couple of issues with it. Firstly, if you don't break up your opponent's synergies, there's a number of synergy decks that will just completely bury you. The blue-white deck, the black-red deck, the blue-red and black-white decks and stuff. They can all do these insanely powerful things that if you aren't prepared to interact with them can destroy you with just off synergy, and they're oftentimes very aggressive as well. Now, the other thing is, speaking of aggression, is that we specifically have put in a lot of cards into the cube that are really good at pushing damage, and we've cut some of the ways to interact with those cards in a way that doesn't require you to dedicate to interacting with it, right? You have to kind of choose a lot of times between a card that's good defensively and good offensively, or good at generating value. And so I do think these green decks are really, really reliable and consistent, but I also think we've made a conscious effort to avoid putting just every single Mold Drifter in the environment. And then our best decks are synergy decks that if you don't interact with them enough to break up their synergies, they will crush you. And some of them, like blue-red, are actually very, very difficult to interact with beyond racing them at times.
Yeah, it's something that I've tried to avoid. We talked on the last episode about cantrip creatures and how good they've gotten recently, and it's very easy to fill out the Peasant Cube with just every single cantrip creature. If this was just an effort with me and nobody else, I wouldn't have Serap's Packmate in this cube, because it's a fine ETB card that replaces itself, but every single set has 2 or 3 of these, and they just kind of bleed together. They lead to this monotonous gameplay where all of your creatures just cantrip into other stuff. But I look for opportunities to play interesting 2-for-1s, right? We have Ravenous Chupacabra in this cube, but we wouldn't want Ravenous Chupacabra, Shriek Maw, Necrotal. You just don't want every single sphere of cards to be doing the same thing. So an example of this, we recently replaced Somber Walled Stag which is a fight creature, with Agatha's Champion, which is a fight creature that only fights if you bargain. That's just way more interesting, right? And you get some upside there. Agatha's Champion, I think, has Trample. It's a 4/4 instead of a 4/3, but you have to bargain, so you have to put in a little bit of work to get it. But there are plenty of creatures out there that don't make you do any work and just give you value. And I think we play a ton of them. Obviously, if you end up in Sultai, you're just going to be playing tons of ETB creatures. We have a blue-white blink deck, which thrives off of ETB creatures. But we want to make sure things are interesting, so we balance that out with the aggressive decks, the decks that are, high synergy. Honestly, you can come in and draft a 4 or 5 color soup deck with a bunch of ETBs and just try to play Moldrifter.deck. It usually loses to the high synergy decks. This is an extremely high synergy format that we're playing with. And once you get the pieces for a specific deck to come together, you usually outpace whatever people are doing if all they're trying to do is play cantrip creatures. So
yeah, and like even these green mid-range decks that I think are really good and consistent, they're still base green, right? Like you're not playing 4 color soup very often. You're typically playing like 80% green cards, and then like you're splashing for a couple of removal spells or a Behold the Unspeakable or whatever. You're trying to be a consistent deck, and one of the features of these decks is recognizing when you need to be the beatdown, which is part of why we removed a card recently. Trumpeting Herd came out of the cube, and part of that is just because when you're on the beatdown plan, it's a Moldrifter that also beats down really well.
Well, let's get into these color pairs here. So I do want to be very clear. Chris and I are very adamant about the difference between what a theme is and an archetype is in Cube. When you use the word archetype, that generally means things like aggro, control, mid-range, like the actual macro archetypes of Magic. We're going to talk about 2 color pairs, and we prefer on this podcast to refer to them as themes. That being said, I'm not perfect. I will probably say the word archetype multiple times in this section, but we want to start using the term theme to describe our 2 color pairs. And our Peasant Cube is built around 2 color pairs, but it was built from the ground up. So we didn't go in saying, oh, these are what our 2 color pairs are going to be. We decided to build out the monocolored sections and see what the 2 colored pairs would look like. And a lot of them have gone through different evolutions here. So we're going to go through all 10 of the intended 2 color pairs and then talk about maybe some of the secret decks that come out. So let's start off with Azorius, blue-white, which is a blink deck. This is actually one of the ones that has gone through the most iterations. When we first built the cube, it was kind of a blue-white mess of like artifact and enchantment payoffs. I think the original Eldraine had just come out, and it was kind of like an All That Glitters deck, but without the support. It didn't really work out. We decided to nix that theme, changed it to blue-white flyers, off of the back of, I think it was Corset 2020 and Corset 2021, both had Flyers themes for blue-white, and we decided to go ahead and incorporate a lot of those gold cards, like the Empyrean Eagle and stuff like that, to make blue-white Flyers. Very linear. People did not enjoy playing it. It was a fine deck. It was basically just an aggro deck that played itself and drafted itself, but you also had to support it with nonsense cards like what is it, Favorable Winds, like the enchantment that gives all flyers +1/+1, and it just wasn't a fun use of individual cards in your cube slots, like cube equity. You using up cube equity for a card like Favorable Winds just makes that spot super rigid. So we decided to nix blue-white flyers, and we ended up getting a fancy little card called Soul Herder on Arena, which is the 3-mana 1/1 that blinks a creature on end step. And ever since we've had Soul Herder, blue-white has been a blink deck.
Yes, I mean, everybody loves ETB blink value decks. It's just one of the things, like you play Magic, you enjoy these kind of decks for some reason. I would go so far almost to say that these decks, you could just call them Soul Herder decks. That's kind of what they get called in Artisan when they show up. Soul Herder might be like the most obvious, like, build around me card, but like it's one that it feels like you get rewarded super hard for having a really good deck with it, and it's also not hard for it to be good. These decks tend to be really good if the game goes long, like you get a lot of pieces. They're big game decks, right, where you want to have a lot of cards on the board, clogging up the ground, cards that gain you life, that reward you for them, being able to be blinked or sitting in play or whatever. One of the things that I think when you're building these decks that you need to consider is making sure you have enough 2-drops in your deck. This is a deck that takes a lot of time to get going. It's playing a lot of expensive cards. A lot of times this is the deck that plays Meteor Golem. It'll play, what's the 2/4 that makes 2 birds we put in? I've seen that card come up.
Soul of Migration.
Yeah, Soul of Migration. It'll play a lot of these expensive cards that will stabilize the board really well. But one of the things that happens is this deck gets run over if you weren't careful. So make sure when you're drafting this deck, you're prioritizing stuff like that play the board early. Norn's Inquisitor and the Spirited Companion are like on theme versions of this effect, but honestly, anything that blocks or attacks reasonably well at 2 mana is what you want. More on the block side. This deck tends to be more defensive.
Yeah, it is like almost by definition just a value pile deck, which those decks get preyed upon by the like super fast decks most of the time, unless you can outvalue them somehow. But your Soul Hoarder is a 1/1, right? It starts off as a 1/1, usually a 2/2 if you get to blink your 2-drop or something like that. So it's a frail little creature. But this deck splashes a lot too. Like, you just want all of the ETBs you can get, so you're willing to splash an off-color ETB like a twin-shot sniper or whatever.
Yeah, and we actually directly support that with the only 3-color card in the cube, which is Lagrella the Magpie, which kind of signals that, like, Bant is a deck. And the green ETB creatures play really, really well with Soul Herder. So sometimes the mana can be a little tough, but if you get the Bant deck together, it is very, very powerful. It's an even better late game deck than the blue-white deck a lot of times. And sometimes blue-white also shows up as like a blue-white tempo deck. We've seen that come up a couple of times, and it's okay. I think it's very feast or famine, where like you turn 1 Fairy Seer, turn 2 Ninja of the Deep Hours your opponent, and then you like counter everything they play, and it's really miserable to play against. Or like you don't do that, and the deck just sort of falls apart.
Yeah, blue-white just lends itself, since it's basically constructive of good ETB creatures. It kind of just exists in the card pool with a couple gold payoffs like Momentary Blink and Soul Herder, but it leads to a lot of cross synergy because the blue ETB creatures are good in all the other blue decks. The white ETB creatures are good in all of the other white decks. You don't really have to force this deck to be there. And we do have like Momentary Blink, we have Touch the Spirit Realm, but those are just fine cards, right? We're not playing 15 other Blink cards. And then you have your things like your what is it called, Zephyr Sentinel and your Core Skyfisher. Like
these are awesome aggressive cards.
Yeah, those are cards that can go in their own separate decks outside of blue-white, but then they're just pseudo-blink cards too. So it's very easy to support, and I imagine moving forward, it's going to remain blue-white. I think it is solidified as the blink deck in this format, unless something crazy happens down the line in a new core set or something to give blue-white more identity. But the Flyers thing was just so linear, and the All That Glitters thing was very niche. So I'm glad we finally got the Soul Herder to give blue-white a real identity here.
And I think it's honestly more likely that we get more blue-white blink support than we get an archetype that unseats this deck, because WotC likes to print blue-white as a blink deck every so often, and they love to give us good ETB creatures. So.
Yeah, and people love playing blink cards, so it all makes sense. Talk to me about Simic. Simic traditionally, up until maybe last year, was the de facto worst color pair, the worst theme in this cube. And I don't think it was like arguable either. Everybody knew Simic was bad. Basically, every set that had ever come out had Simic pegged as either a weird typal deck that doesn't translate into cube, or as a ramp deck, and Arena didn't really have the ramp targets. But I think the key thing that happened was Colossal Sky Turtle got printed in Neo Kamigawa, and from Colossal Sky Turtle forward till present day, green has been getting really good ramp on Arena, and green has been getting really good threats on Arena, which are the two things that Simic wants to do. So talk to me about Simic. I know that you are a big fan of this, and it has gone from one of our worst decks to possibly one of the best in the cube.
Yeah, so I mean, I've kind of I don't want to say pioneered, but I've really been a proponent of this sort of Sultai archetype that just it plays as a mid-range deck typically, you know, kind of what you would expect to see in a general cube where you're playing a lot of the 1 and 2 mana dorks, and then you're trying to ramp into these mid-range threats and then having a lot of top end. This deck doesn't necessarily want to be Simic. I think Simic lacks the interaction to be really, really good, but you'll very frequently play this as a Sultai deck where you're playing some blue cards. Like I mentioned earlier, Behold the Unspeakable is a really, really big one that is worth double splashing for. And Necrotal creatures are really kind of the bread and butter of these style of decks. And we'll get more into this in green-black, because I think I typically am more interested in drafting green-black and using blue as my third color than playing pure Simic. But these creatures like Agatha's Champion, Faerzban Brawler, Atsakan Archer is one that I know a lot of people will say that this card is bad. They pass it all the time. Atsakan Archer is one of the most important cards in this style of deck. The reason for that is that firstly, these decks tend to be soft to flyers. So there aren't actually that many reach creatures in our cube. And Atsakan Archer blocks basically all of them that don't cost 7 mana. And then also, there are a lot of utility creatures like Blood Artist or random flyers with utility effects, random X1s. Rosy Cotton's another good example of cards that will just like kind of bury you if they sit in play. And Atsugan Archer almost always has something to come down and kill. And so it's just a really, really important card as a relatively cheap play that stabilizes your board. So I'm a huge fan of this style of deck, but we're going to get more into it in green-black. I think the blue-green version, you probably want to lean more towards a beatdown plan where you're playing like a 4-drop on turn 3 and then just slamming like 4, 5, 6 mana fatties and trying to close out the game, because you can't go super long against these synergy decks because you don't have the interaction. So just start slamming fatties, Waker of Waves, and Colossal Sky Turtles and cards. I love when they print cards like that Mirror Shell Crab, where these are cards that have like a spell function if you draw them early into the game. And then they're also like your big Mamma Jamma finisher. I think it was you who suggested putting in the flashback creature spells from Midnight Hunt, the Rise of the Ants and Shadow Beast Sighting. And those are also fantastic in this deck because while they aren't exactly mana efficient, this deck very frequently ends up with a lot of mana and not a lot of stuff to spend it on. And those cards give you stuff to spend your mana on productively.
That was a huge shifting point too, and Chris gives me a lot of credit for this, and I think it really did bolster what Simic was doing. But Simic was, like I said, clearly last place, just not doing so well. Even with Sky Turtle, that's only one card in the cube, right? So I was brainstorming, how do you get Simic on the level of what all the other 2-for-1 decks are able to do? And, Flashback came to mind, so I looked through Flashback cards, and it turns out with the ramp and with the, even, fine Flashback cards like Shadow Beast Sighting and stuff like that, as well as the self-mill that bleeds over into Golgari, it felt like there was something there. We tried it out, and, the actual Flashback cards are quite good at giving you more to do with your mana. Because it used to be that you would play your Sifter Worm on turn 5, your opponent would eat it with a removal spell, and it was like, oh, well, that was my finisher, so now I'm trying to scrap things together with mana dorks and 4/4s, and that just doesn't get it done. So there's a lot more resilience to the deck now. There are better top-end threats, there's much better ramp, and there's more 2-for-1 potential. There's more ways to dump your mana in the late game. So Simic doing quite well these days. I'm glad it's finally dug out. And I think we're at a point with Simic being good that there isn't a deck in this, there isn't a theme in this cube that I would say is clearly last place anymore. I think everything's competitive now. And speaking of competitive, talking about blue-red, is it spells? This has been traditionally the best deck in the cube. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but it's always seemed that Izzet and Orzhov are the top tier decks. And Izzet's really good, and it plays multiple different ways as well. I think it's just off of the efficiency of good, cheap spells and a couple payoffs. The two versions here, there's really a control version and an aggro version. The control version tends to be a heavy blue deck with some red interaction, but that's the one that's playing all the counter spells and your defensive creatures like Murmur and Mystic. And then you have your aggro version, which is very heavy red with maybe a couple cantrips for your spell payoffs. This is the one that plays Balmor and then Electrostatic Infantry, just these cards, these spell payoffs that convert all of your spells into a bunch of damage. It's hard to say too much creative stuff about Izzet. It's a spells deck. I mean, it's all it's ever been in the history of Magic, and that translates here as well.
Yeah, and then part of why it's so good is that the blue-red theme is almost always spells. And when you have a theme that is printed for 10 years straight as like the theme that this color pair is doing, you end up with some serious power outliers. I think this deck also, one of the benefits of this deck is you get some extremely powerful cards that no other decks are really interested in. Like Hearth Elemental and Balmor, Electrostatic Infantry are all ridiculous Magic cards, but the only deck that can really reliably play these cards is the Izzet deck. And so you get like these 10 out of 10 cards that nobody else is even remotely interested in that you can wheel. And I think the red version, if you have a choice, is the version you want to be in. All the best cards that I just mentioned, Hearth Elemental, Electrostatic Infantry, Balmor, these are all cards that really do well at facilitating at killing your opponent. Pyromancer and Third Path Iconoclast are way better when those tokens are able to convert into damage instead of just chump blocks. Not that the blue version is bad by any means. It's just the red version plays into what this deck is doing best, I think.
Is it also happens to be one of the decks that have taught us one of our biggest lessons as designers, and that's that you don't have to over support a spells theme in any cube. If you have like 10 plus instants and 10 plus sorceries in your red and blue sections respectively, then you already have an Is It deck with just a few payoffs. You don't then need to plant a bunch of spells payoffs because you already have so much of the cube dedicated to what a Is It spells deck is already doing. So we used to, when we first started designing this Peasant Cube, we used to have all sorts of spell payoffs, basically secret gold cards like Gutter Snipe. Like, they were all over the place, and we just found out that you don't need that many payoffs for the deck. You need a couple payoffs, and you need spells, and you're in a cube, so you're probably already playing the spell. So you don't have to go out of your way to over-support it. It just kind of naturally comes together with a few spell payoffs.
Yeah, this sort of reminds me of what happened with Luris in Modern, where when Luris was printed, it turns out the optimal thing to do is just to put more good cards in your deck, and then you get to play Luris on top of that, as opposed to putting a bunch of clunky 4 and 5 mana cards in your deck. And that's kind of what we're seeing here, is that the Is It deck rewards you for building the way modern Magic decks want to be built, which is to play just a stack of 2-drops. Yeah. And when you're just playing all these like really cheap, really efficient cards that trade up on mana, you just get ahead a lot more in games. And then you add on to the fact that the expensive cards you are playing tend to be really good at generating value, and you just have a recipe for success.
Yeah, I mean, it all bears out in gameplay. Is It still holds up. We had to nerf Is It multiple times, like Crackling Drake and Sprite Dragon had to come out. They died for the sins of Is It spells being too good.
Might still have some of the best gold cards in the cube. And I think this deck, I think the biggest restraining thing on this deck is that everybody knows blue-red is really good. And so it's more difficult to get a really, really busted version of the deck. But if you're ever the only person drafting this at a table, you've just got the best deck at the table most of the time. To the point that I actually had a relatively weak pack this week and first picked up Allmore. I did not end up playing blue-red, but like that's how powerful I think this deck is, right? Is that I'm willing to, at a weak pack, first pick an Is It gold card because the deck is just like so powerful when it comes together.
Yeah, and it's also the fact that there are two different Is It decks in the cube that come together with different cards. There's the aggressive version and the controlling version. The fact that those exist side by side means this is one of the only color pairs where two people can be an Is It at the table and walk away with good decks. We've seen, Is It versus Is It in the finals of this Peasant Cube before, and it's just two different flavors of Is It. Not a lot of other color pairs can do that without splashing around, but Is It is very deep, and that's just because there's a huge roster of instants and sorceries, and you just get a couple payoffs, you throw them in, right? That moves us to Dimir, blue-black. This is one of the less thematic themes in the cube. It's hard to pin exactly what the name of the Dimir deck is, but I do call it Turbo Mill at this point. It's really trying to fill its own graveyard for various things. It's almost an amalgamation of a bunch of different sub-themes that just play well together. It's kind of like blue-black good stuff control, right? It tends to be a control deck. It wants really good removal. It wants defensive options. It wants counter spells. And then it can either sub in a small reanimator theme with the black reanimator cards and some of the creatures that get themselves into the graveyard, like Waker of Waves and Mirror Shell Crab. Or it's playing this extremely spell-heavy version that bleeds over into Is It, where you're trying to finish up with Rise from the Tides or Mouth of Sauron or Tolarian Terror. There's multiple cards in this card pool now that care about the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard, and that's kind of Dimir's best place to play in. What's your take on blue-black? Do you feel like it's best played as a 3-color deck, or it shows up more often as a 3-color deck, or do you feel like there's something really tight that blue-black is doing?
I think it does play best as a control deck. You want to be playing a lot of interaction, a lot of control-y cards, and then getting good value. I think the gold cards in this section are extremely powerful. They're some of the best in the cube. Mouth of Sauron is ridiculous. Halo Forager is just unreal how good that card is. Invasion of Amonkhet is... Obviously, if you played Mom Draft, you know how good that card is, and it's still in the cube. So the gold cards here are just ridiculous. I think the main thing is I don't really consider this a mill deck. I mean, I think you can have mill sub-themes in your deck. You'll play a defensive creature like Mire Triton, for example, that mills you, or Ransack the Lab for spells that mills you. But mostly you just want to be playing like really good interaction. And the interaction you play doesn't actually matter as long as you have the density, right? You just want to be able to interact with what your opponent is doing and have answers to different problems they may present. I think this deck does frequently splash, though. Usually when I've seen it, the last couple of weeks, I've seen a white splash for Imperial Oath, which was a card we added specifically for that to give like an incentive to play white in your blue-black deck or like your grindy deck. So that was cool. And then I played a Grixis deck. It was not that good, but also I was splashing like Fear Fire Foes and some other really powerful red cards. So I think you see this deck bleed over frequently, but part of it is just because it's a grindy deck. You've got a lot of time in these games to draw into a couple of off-color sources and like your 1 to 2 splash cards. And I think you can oftentimes get a really big power increase from those cards. This is probably the best deck for Behold the Unspeakable as well, which is a extremely powerful card from Neo Kamigawa. This is just a deck that really leverages that card because you want to draw cards and have time, and it's a giant finisher that also stabilizes the board for a turn. It's just a really powerful card in this deck.
Yeah, this is like more of a traditional control deck, whereas is usually like control plus burn or something, or control plus like a couple small critters that break through, or your pyromancers. Like control with spells, this is more just traditional control. You want your pile of Doomblades, you want your counter spells, and you usually want just like a good finisher or two at the top end. And that's where the Reanimator sub-theme comes in, is you can just play cards like Mirror Shell Crab and Waker of Waves, and they just end up in your graveyard because you can channel them or discard them or whatever. And then you play a card like the Eldest Reborn, that interacts with the board and then eventually gives you one of those big creatures back to finish with that you can back up. I do like that you can do the spells version of Dimir now as well, with a lot of the cards either filling up your graveyard or counting the number of spells in your graveyard. And you'll often splash something like Imperial Oath or Gandalf's Sanctions as like a big finisher for this deck. So it's not as thematically defined as other color pairs, but if you come to the cube and you draft a bunch of blue and black cards with a strategy in mind, it is going to perform well. Dimir has also traditionally been a very good deck.
Yeah, I'll say this deck is also really, really fun to play. You feel very big brain. There's a lot of decision points where you get to make a choice in the game that matters. One tip, too, is that I would suggest is don't think of this like you might a constructed control deck. You do want to play, 7, 8, 9, 10 creatures, give or take, depends on your spells payoffs, but you want to have enough that you can play to the board, particularly stuff like Oracle of Tragedy that can be a good defensive creature so you don't have to use a removal spell on the first creature your opponent plays.
Yeah, it's one of the decks that's probably the deck that is capable of having the most demoralizing effect on your opponent. Like, it's the one that can have 7 cards in its hand on turn, like 10, while your opponent is like top decking, and you just know anything you top deck is going to get countered or removed. That's not always how it plays, but it is the kind of de facto control deck of the environment, at least control in a different way than what it's doing. But to move on from control straight into red-white, Boros, go wide, aggro. Not super thematic, but still very good. Like, Boros doesn't have to be doing anything cute here. It's just trying to build out a board and attack your opponent to death. It's kind of hard to come up with too much else to talk about with Boros. It's pretty straightforward, but it's a good deck, and it actually just, I think, got a huge bump up in Wilds of Eldraine from like 4 or 5 different cards that we added. So, I mean, anything special here about Boros other than just turn sideways and kill your opponent?
I mean, it is a deck that tends to win or lose rather spectacularly. You either kill your opponent and your opponent's like, wow, there was literally nothing I could do this game. Or like you draw too many lands and you're like, I played a Ginger Brute and then a 2-drop and then had nothing else to do.
It is the deck where if you go 1-drop, 2-drop and your opponent responds with 1-drop removal, 2-drop removal, you're kind of like, well, I'm going to have a really tough time winning this game.
Yeah. It does have a lot of like really particular synergies that are good, and they're pretty much all just revolve around going wide. And that's why, like, if you've played Wilds of Eldraine at all, you know how good Imodane's Recruiter is, and it lives up to the bill here. It's that card is unreal and is leveraged into the last 2 3-0 decks that we had. The card's just so ridiculous in aggressive decks.
Yeah, it's so good. It's gonna be on my watch list moving forward, because we have done 2 Peasant Cube drafts since Wilds of Eldraine came out, and Imodane's Recruiter has appeared in the 3-0 decks for both weeks. So that card is kind of nuts. But there's also a lot of cards and things planted into the cube to try and help leverage the fact that Boros needs more velocity. So there's a lot of looting effects. There are things like Scrapwork, Witch's Mark. There's a lot of good adventure cards that just naturally are 2-for-1s. There's things like the sack lands that you can slot in here, Thraben Inspector. There's a lot of velocity you can get out of Boros. Richard, who was very fundamental in shaping the Peasant Cube, hasn't been with us too much lately, but he's one of our admin. He loved Boros. Boros was kind of his baby, and if he ever drafted, he would be playing a Boros deck more likely than not. And I would always be surprised by how much velocity he would have. Like, it felt like you were just never running the Boros deck out of cards, even though if the Boros deck does, run out of cards, it's usually dead in the water. But it has a lot of hasty threats. It can leverage a lot of removal in different ways. It can kill you super fast. It's probably the fastest deck in the format if it gets to do its thing. And it is the reason that you should draft removal highly when you get the chance.
Yeah, anything that rewards you for going big. So all the gold cards pretty much do this. They signal that you want to be playing cards like Rally at the Hornburg, or cards that generate multiple game pieces that can attack, and then pumping them and killing your opponent. You don't need too many of those effects, but you do usually want to have something to really go over the top, or you want to have a high density of burn.
It's also the color pair that benefits the most from having the rare dual lands, right? Because Boros needs to play its 1-drops on turn 1. And in order to do that, if you have a pile of like Savannah Lions and some of them are red and some of them are white, you just need to guarantee that you can cast your 1-drop on turn 1. And that's where those untapped Boros lands come in play. So if you're drafting Boros, you should pick your dual lands as high as like the best possible cards. Maybe Imidane's Recruiter is better than a dual land. I have trouble, thinking I would ever pick a land over Recruiter if I'm Boros.
There's not much else you would take. Yeah, the dual lands are super important. Also, one tip here, in addition to the card selection kind of cards being really important, I would also suggest making sure if you can, prioritize your 1-drops to one color. So if you can have like 6 white 1-drops or 6 red 1-drops, that's going to be better than having 3 of each.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's Boros. It's trying to attack you down. It's not the cutest deck in the format, but it is good to have all of your pillars covered. And when you have good control decks, you need to make sure you have good aggro decks. So we do a lot to support everything there. That's going to move us into Orzhov, which, as I just mentioned with Izzet, is one of the best decks in the format, even though it's gone through some fundamental shifts. Historically, this started off as black-white life gain. Chris is just not a fan of life gain as a theme in general because it feels like it's dragging games on without a lot of payoff. And I get that. There's not a lot of actual payoff for life gain. You don't want a ton of lifelink creatures floating around. Otherwise, you're kind of invalidating the aggro deck. So it makes sense. We ended up scrapping that.
The aggro gamer wants to cut all the life gain. I'm sure there's nothing going on there.
No. Definitely not.
Chris is known for 2 things: turning cards sideways and sacrificing them.
Yep, and life gain is contradictory to that, so suspicious. No, Blackway, it was also just parasitic. You have to have these like weird life gain payoffs and stuff like that, and it doesn't really bleed over into other color pairs that well. We ended up nixing that theme. We changed it to black-white aristocrats, which was basically almost a carbon copy of red-black aristocrats. And very recently, we did another shift. We noticed there were just 2 aristocrats decks, and sometimes you got Mardu aristocrats, and it felt like we could shape things up to have a little bit more, a different theme, basically, for Orzhov. So we shifted it towards this. How would you define this? Like a black-white kind of small ball recursive deck? It's not quite Reanimator.
I usually say Dork Reanimator, but or Dork Recursion Midrange. It's really just a lot of the good white cards and black cards are cheap. And there's a lot of cards they've printed recently that let you bring back small dorky threats. Yeah. And then there's some good payoffs for those too. So, for example, Archfiend's Vessel is a 1-mana 1/1 lifelink. Not the most exciting card in the world, but you can play it on 1 and attack and gain a couple, drain them for a couple. But if you reanimate it out of the graveyard, if you return from the graveyard to the battlefield, you sack it, exile it, and get a 5/5 flying demon. So this deck is really explosive in that you can play that on turn 1. Turn 2, you can Village Rites into an Unearth on that card. And on turn 2, you have a 5/5 flying lifelink card, flying demon that also drew you 2 cards.
Yeah, I mean, Archfiend's Vessel is like the coolest thing you can do for sure, but you just end up with a pile of cards like Unearth. Return Triumphant, I think, is the new one. I think we actually have Recommission in right now, but I think I'm going to make a case for swapping those 2. No One Left Behind is a really cool card. That's the 5 mana reanimate a creature, but you only spend 2 mana on it if it targets a creature with mana value 3 or less, I think.
We just got Back for Seconds.
Yeah, back for seconds. Like, this is a recursive pile for the most part, but it's playing kind of a bit of an aggro strategy. So we shifted away from the aristocrats, kind of draw the game out forever and bleed you out with Blood Artist type deck. And now you're trying to actually kill your opponent through attacking and combat damage, but you have a lot of recursive elements to make sure that your creatures keep coming back. And one of the gold cards here, what is it called? Breathless Knight? Is
very sweet card.
Really, yeah, it's signaling exactly what the deck wants to do. That's a 3-mana 2/2. Does it have lifelink?
It does. So it's flying and lifelink, and if it or another creature gets returned from the graveyard to the battlefield, it gets a +1 counter. So usually this card's going to be a 3/3 flying lifelink for 3 mana. That's how it usually ends up playing out, and it's a very, very powerful card, but it encourages you to be attacking. So this deck is like a mid-range deck, but it's definitely on the aggressive end of mid-range. You're wanting to... you can grind really well. I played this deck a few weeks ago to a 2-1 finish, and like the amount of games where you would just be sitting there and you would keep finding things to do was really impressive. It also leverages some cards that I think are pretty powerful, but like a little underplayed. So cards like Guildsworn Prowler are really powerful in this deck because it's just a good aggressive card that eventually trades for a 2-for-1 on your opponent because you're always attacking.
It's worth noting that we're not explicitly supporting aristocrats in this color pair anymore, but you can still kind of get the pieces to come together. You have all your white token makers, you have all of your black sacrifice effects. You can still combine those together and play black-white sacrifice with maybe a little bit of a recursive theme there for your Blood Artist type cards, but it's not the archetype or I keep saying archetype again, that's not the theme that we're explicitly trying to support here. We're trying to go for this little small ball recursive effect. And then you have the opposite end too, where you do have a bunch of big reanimation spells and big creatures that come back. We have a Troll of Khazad-dûm in here now. We have what's the Soul of Migration is a good card that puts itself in the graveyard, and you can actually combine the big reanimator and the little reanimator together to kind of just get these recursive piles going. So Orzhov plays in a lot of different ways now. I do like the shift that it has taken away from aristocrats, so that's like definitively Rakdos's section of the cube. But yeah, this is a sweet little deck that I haven't really gotten my hands on too much since we've made the shift.
The most interesting thing going on here is because you have all these recursive pieces, you do have to be very careful in deck construction. It's really fun to sit there and weave this sort of thread this needle between having enough creatures that your recursion works, right? And then also filling in removal spots. So you have to really think about all the card you're putting into your deck more than other decks, right? Because in a lot of decks, all of your non-creature spells are just going to be removal spells, and that's it. This deck has to leverage a bunch of different moving pieces that makes it really fun to draft.
Yeah, I'm hoping we can fire off a little bit more so I can try this one out. But that moves us into Selesnya, which is the theme that has undergone the most recent change. For the longest time, almost 3 years, Selesnya was just +1/+1 counters, mostly off the back of sets like March of the Machine, and I think it was Core Set 2021 that had like the Centaur, that the hardened scales type effect and stuff like that. We noticed very recently that two things. First off, it's a very parasitic deck. You have to use a lot of design space in your cube, a lot of cube equity to support +1/+1 counter effects that aren't necessarily great outside of like Selesnya and maybe even Boros. They're eating up a lot of cube equity, and also in gameplay, the deck is just like a huge glass cannon. It was probably capable of the best possible starts, right? You go 1-drop into 2-drop Centaur into like a +1/+1 counter effect, and everything gets double counters and you're smashing for like 7. But if your opponent had a removal spell for your Centaur, your game basically just crumbles. So we didn't like the way it was playing out and the way it was eating up design space in the cube. So we sat down and figured out what could Selesnya do in our card pool instead. We landed on tokens, and this is a fundamental shift that we've only played with for like 1 or 2 cube iterations here. Not too much to say about it. Green tokens plus white tokens come together with a couple sweep-in, board pump type effects. It plays really well with the Boros sphere because Boros wants to go wide stuff. And then there's some explicit token payoffs, like Telda's mentioned Rosy Cotton a couple times. We put Intangible Virtue back in. There's Peregrine Took and Shire Sheriff as cards that specifically mention tokens. I think we have Woodland Champion in, which is a 2-mana 2/2 that gets bigger every time you play a token. There are explicit token payoffs, but it's not as parasitic as the +1/+1 counter theme, and it bleeds over into other color pairs well. So maybe not the most exciting thing in the world, but doing something that leverages what Selesnya can do in the cube in a way that makes more sense for the cube as a whole, instead of just here's this one deck. It was kind of like the blue-white Flyers deck, right? Like, here's this color pair that does this one thing, and that's all you can do.
It also synergizes with a couple of cards we had added beforehand, trying to support. Like, we added Imperial Oath, and that card just is like a really powerful piece of top end for this deck. The one time we've seen it so far, it came up as a Naya deck, which we kind of expected might be a possibility, and we're pretty cool with. The green deck ideally is going to be a bit of a bigger deck where you're playing a slower game plan. You know, you're playing your Ridgescale Tusker and your Bestial Menace and these cards that add a lot of oomph to the board but are a little expensive, and kind of play with the green dorks in that way. But you can also play it as a more aggressive deck with the Naya stuff. I mean, I got hit with Rosie Cotton into Rally at the Hornburg, and that is a disgusting combo you can do in Boros. Mm-hmm. But if you're playing more of those green tokens as well, you have more support to make it a little deeper. So I don't know if it'll be like this forever, but the problem with green-white is you have to find things that green and white are both doing. And a lot of times those outside of tokens are kind of, as you mentioned, parasitic. A lot of times green-white is the enchantments deck, but like, that's a lot of space that you would have to put in, just like the +1 counters, to support that archetype. Whereas the tokens thing just kind of happens organically because both colors, at least white's really good at making tokens, and green has a few cards that are really good at it alongside some good payoffs.
Yeah, and one thing I like is that this has prospects for the future that the +1/+1 counter deck doesn't really have. Like, you're always going to get +1/+1 counter effects, but once you have, like, the best effects, are you really going to get better effects in every set? Like, maybe you upgrade a card here and there for your +1/+1 counter deck, but it really becomes stagnant. Whereas the token deck, I think they've done two things really well in Modern design with tokens, is they have more effects that care about tokens in general rather than just creature tokens. So think like your Peregrine Took, your Shire Sheriff, your Rosie Cotton. These trigger off any kind of tokens, and that plays into all of these different token types that they're making, like blood tokens and food tokens, all these things that they're pushing every set. I think we're getting map tokens, yeah, whatever those are. You know, treasure tokens are, 50 cards are contractually obligated in every set to say treasure token on them. So you just end up with all these different token types that you're incidentally playing, and the payoffs are good. Like Peregrine Took makes a food token every time you make any kind of token, which is kind of cool. I'm excited to see how this plays out, and I'm excited that it plays into other themes here as well. So we'll see how it all pans out. That moves us to Gruul. Gruul's one of the least exciting to talk about. Like, there's nothing exciting going on here, but it's just a good stompy deck. Like, just because it's not exciting doesn't mean it's not good,
I think the real draw into this deck is the Soul Ring of our cube, Goblin and Archomancer. That card is completely ludicrous and will lead to some very insane starts where you're playing, like, you go 1 mana dork on 1 into an Archomancer plus 2-drop on 2 into, like, ridiculousness on turn 3, right? Or turn 4. Just some of the starts that I've seen out of this deck are pretty absurd. It leverages the 2-mana burn spells really well off an Archomancer. Basically, this deck just, like, it's Gruul, it stomps things, but if you have an Archomancer, it's very, very explosive. It leverages some of the bigger red cards, Charging Mosasaur, Aimer, the Riddermark type cards really well, because it's a red deck that wants to go a little bigger.
Yeah, it's a little bit softer of a ramp deck than Simic, right? It's the ramp deck that wants to play 2 mana dork into 4 mana 4/4 with the upside, whereas Simic kind of wants to go, 1 mana dork into 2 mana dork into, like, here are my 5, 6, and 7 drops, It bleeds over a little. Sometimes you see Teamer as well, where you're just playing all the good ramp and then all of the good stompy cards in, green, red, and blue, I guess, blue stompy cards. But yeah, it's not exciting. It's not super thematic. A lot of times the red-green theme in limited sets is 4 power matters, but they never support it with real cards. So it's kind of like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, I think Picnic Ruiner is one that we didn't put in the initial set review, but I actually think it's pretty good. It could see a slot here potentially if you wanted to put a little bit of support for that kind of 4 power matters. But that's mostly just because Picnic Ruiner is like a pretty generically good card, right?
Yeah, and then we have Garruk's Uprising, a card that I fight to hold on to, which is the one that gives all your creatures trample and then cantrips whenever you play 4 power creatures. There are just naturally a bunch of 4 power creatures, so if you're in Gruul, you'll end up with that. But it's a stompy deck. Like, it's not the most exciting thing in the world to talk about. It's not the most thematic thing in the world. And maybe this is one where I have hopes for the future that they find cool design space for Gruul, because it feels like it's never a thematic deck, but not everything has to be, and that's fine.
Yeah, just being boring doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't show up super often, but the last time I saw it 3-0'd me pretty hard. It just completely crushed me with an Archomancer on 2 in both games.
Yeah, it feels like the type of deck that's able to fizzle out, but if you get a good version of it, it's good. So it's probably like one of those middle decks. Maybe not the worst deck in the format, but certainly not the best. And, you know, I'm scrapping for fun things to say about Gruul. It's not it's not the craziest thing in the world. But moving on from there, let's talk about the rest of the Jund decks here. Green-black, Golgari, and, I mean, I'm just going to call this the graveyard deck, right? It's again, hard to, you know, peg exactly what the name of the deck is, but if you look traditionally at the last 5 years of Golgari themes in Limited, it's always like something graveyard deck. It's very rarely anything other than that, and it's always a little bit vague, not super well supported in Limited. Like, when was the last time Green Black was the best deck in a Limited format? Don't say Wilds of Eldraine.
Yeah, I was about to say that. But yeah, the graveyard theme is also like never good. It's just always like we have like 10 years with the graveyard cards, and still they like the gold cards are just not that for the most part.
Right. In a lot of ways, Green-Black is almost the Spider Spawning deck, right? Like, that's how it gets played a lot, or it gets played as the base of, like, a multicolor Sultai pile. It's actually very rare that Golgari is just Green-Black with no splash.
Yeah, I'm more into the straight Green-Black good stuff deck than other people are. When other people draft it, they tend to lean really hard on Spider Spawning, and I find that card to be a little hard to build around with how I build these decks, but still, you know, I very frequently will run it if it makes my deck, but I'm very much into the ramp into like green threats, play removal, and kill them.
Yeah, this used to be built a little bit as like a permanent recursion style deck where you're using cards like Acolyte of Affliction to rebuy sagas like Binding of the Old Gods. There's a Fungal Rebirth which can rebuy permanents, and you're just trying to like outvalue your opponent and maybe win with like a big creature or something like that. There's a couple unearthed creatures like Archfiend of Sorrow's First Sphere Gargantua. This can play the Reanimator theme as well with the big Reanimator spells and the land cyclers like Generous Ent and the Troll of Khazad-dûm. It can do a lot of different things. It's the deck that benefits best from self-mill creatures like Mire Triton and Satyr Wayfinder, just filling up the graveyard. But yeah, it's a flexible deck that doesn't have a huge theme to it. Usually gets played as a multicolored deck and just kind of does general graveyard stuff. You have here as a note, Poison the Cup is S tier in this deck.
Yeah, if you're playing this deck and you open a Poison the Cup, you take Poison the Cup. For those at home, that's the 3-mana murder effect, 2 black and a colorless for an instant. It has Foretell, and you can cast it for black 1 with the Foretell cost. And if you cast it out of the Foretell zone, you get to scry 2. And that's why it's good, right? Like, typically this deck, you want to have like one piece of just kill anything. But the big thing is this kills anything and then sets up your next draw so that you're not drawing lands. A lot of times in the mid game, this deck is sort of soft to not having anything left to do. And as I've mentioned before, having things to spend your mana on is really important. So Poison the Cup a lot of times will bail you out of a bad situation where your opponent plays a big threat. You know, they play their 6 or 7 drop or whatever. You kill it, and then you get to make sure your next draw is really good. So Poison the Cup is just a card that I value super, super highly in this particular deck. The idea with this deck is just always having something to do with your mana while, you know, you're advancing the board every single turn and like you want to be leveraging early pressure as well if you can, because if you play a 4/4 for 4 on turn 3 and you're able to attack your opponent a couple of times before they get set up, now you're able to make attacks later down the road where your opponent doesn't have good blocks. And that's really important for this style of deck. This is probably the deck that's really the best at just going way over the top of everybody. Archfiend of Sorrow is a degenerate magic card. It'll win you a lot of games you have no business winning. So draft that card highly as well.
Exactly. Let's wrap up the theme talk here with Rakdos, which is Chris's pet deck. I know Chris hasn't played in a while, but Rakdos is still Sacrifice Energy and always has been the Aristocrats deck. Like I said, it was overlapping with Orzhov a lot, and what that meant is the Blood Artist effects, which are tantamount to this deck, your Blood Artist, Zulaport, Cutthroat, Bastion of Remembrance, that used to kind of get 50-50 split between the Rakdos drafter and the Orzhov drafter, and now, even though those cards can be played in like Golgari or Orzhov still, the Rakdos drafter usually gets their hands on at least 2 to 3 of these effects instead of trying to fight somebody for them, and they are really, really important, right? Rakdos is more or less a aggressive deck, that is looking to try to do some sort of combo-esque finish, not A plus B combo, but you're usually trying to have a super aggressive start where you get your opponent down to like 10 life, and then you're looking to drain them out with sacrifice effects and blood arts and stuff like that. I like your note here. You said 12 is not a safe life total against Rakdos. It really isn't, because you're going to die to the Blood Artist. You're going to die to a flurry of burn spells. So you really have to keep up with their early aggression. This deck is flexible. You can go super aggressive. You can focus on 1 and 2 drops. You can focus on recursive creatures. There's a lot of different things you can do in this sphere that all play really well together no matter which direction you go.
Yeah, I think the direct sacrifice deck tends to be the most played version of this deck, but we also just haven't gotten a good like red black grindy gold card like we have at the unrestricted cube. So more often than not, you just end up in this aggressive space naturally. But yeah, like if you like playing combo-y stuff, this is definitely the deck that does that. It feels really silly when this deck comes together and does its thing. And one of the things about this deck is it has inevitability. So if you just like sit there and you aren't trying to kill your opponent, you're going to probably lose to when they string together a good draw. This is the deck that really encourages you, even in your control decks, to have like a turn the corner moment where you transition from the stifling their early game to the killing them before they kill you phase of the game.
Exactly. Yeah, and I like to joke around that reassembling skeleton is actually the best card for this cube, or for this theme, because it is the body that just keeps coming back and feeling all of your sacrifice effects. And maybe that's not even that far off, and maybe that's not hyperbole. Reassembling skeleton is so good.
It is
in this deck. This deck can also play some of the like unearth effects that we talked about with Orzhov, like again, cross-pollinating, making sure that the themes that we have in this cube play well with other themes in case people do want to do 3-color decks and stuff like that. So you will sometimes see a Mardu sacrifice deck with like token makers and stuff like that and more unearthed style cards. And the No One Left Behind card, again, really shining here because those Blood Artists are super important. This is also one of the reasons that I am more comfortable with exile-based effects in this cube than I am in the unrestricted cube, is because there's so many recursive strategies that we want to make sure we have safety valves against those. So there are exile effects, ad nauseum in this cube to make sure you can break up other people's recursive stuff. Because sometimes if you don't have an exile effect and your opponent gets some sort of recursive loop going with Reassembling Skeleton or, God forbid, Sky Turtle in a different deck, like it's really hard to fight through those sometimes. So Rakdos is good. It always has been just really good. And now that it's not fighting Orzhov for those key effects, it usually comes together as intended more often than not.
Yeah, I think it plays really, really well. And I think it's also a deck that, looking to the future, will almost certainly continue to get support. It's just kind of what Red Black's theme is in most sets, is sacrificing stuff. So I think it's also a fun deck to play against because it encourages you to trade with them and then try to kill them. Like there's a tension there with the game that a lot of times you look back on a decision, you're like, okay, I could have tried to turn the corner a turn earlier and maybe I would have been in this game. And instead they top decked their Blood Artist and killed me. So there's a lot of times you look back on your gameplays with this and you could have played a little tighter to trying to beat this deck specifically. I think that's not always true. Sometimes like the blue-red or the blue-black deck just string together a really powerful draw and you never felt like you had a chance.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you mentioned that. This Red-Black Sacrifice is the Red-Black theme in most limited sets, and that usually comes together as an Act of Treason style deck where you're looking to steal an opponent's creature and then sacrifice it. That's not quite what's here in our design. You're more using the merit of your own cards to sacrifice things. In fact, I don't even think we have an Act of Treason effect in our cube at the moment, but you're not really doing the Act of Treason thing. So if you've played Retail Limited where the sacrifice deck lives or dies by how many active treasons you can get, that's a little bit different than what we're doing here.
This is also a spot where you should be grateful that we use the rarity restrictions on Arena, because for those who don't know, Goblin Bombardment is an uncommon in its original printing, and I will tell you it would be completely and utterly degenerate in this deck.
I don't know that I knew Goblin Bombardment was an uncommon. That's a peasant card. I just can't imagine a peasant environment that has Skull Clamps and Goblin Bombardments in it. That just seems like egregious.
Yeah, we've already banned Weaponize the Monsters, and Makeshift Munitions is a good card. So just imagine that there's no cost to it,
Yeah, I wanted to very briefly touch on the quote-unquote ban list. But before we do that, how do you feel about monocolor decks versus and or multicolor decks like the 4+ color piles in this cube? Do you find that monocolor works for any of the color pairs, or do you find that there's an incentive to do 4 5 color piles in this cube?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not big on 4 or 5 color piles. I think that you very frequently just don't need that many colors. I think you can get a good quality of card without that. Also, there's just less raw power here, so you want your cards to work well together. And usually when you start stretching into like a 3rd or 4th color, or 4th or 5th color rather, you're really getting to the point where a lot of your cards are not synergistic enough to actually do anything. You know, we'll see. We've seen Naya and Sultai do pretty well. Mardu used to be a thing, and those are cards where the shards actually share some overlap. But I think when you move into the 4th one, you're maybe splashing for 1 card, and your mana takes a hit too. It's very difficult to get mana good enough to support that. For monocolor, I mean, like we've seen some almost mono white decks or actual mono white decks and mono red. I think those are kind of the ones where you could conceivably put together a 1 color aggressive deck if it's super open. So, you know, there's reasons you might play like a 1 or a like 4 or 5 color deck. I think most of the decks in this format tend to be 2 or 3 colors though, just to hit that level of consistency, synergy, and power, kind of meeting in the middle somewhere.
Yeah. 2 plus a splash is probably the most common, like trophy in decks is usually probably 2 plus a splash for like 1 or 2 cards or something that fit the theme. And that I think that's to the credit of the design. Obviously, I'm not patting myself on the back, but we did make sure that there's a lot of crossover with different color pairs here. I will say the 5 color soup thing, I know there are people who come into cubes and that's all they want to do is draft 5 color. I think that's actively worse than any given 2 color pair in this cube because of how tight some of the themes are. You're not really getting a power level boost by adding extra colors to your deck. At least not the 4 or 5 color piles. You can do the 3 color thing where, you know, you've overlapped Boros and Selesnya and you made Naya tokens and stuff like that. That's fine. But just draft in all of the best gold cards, a bunch of fixin' and hoping it works out. The Mole Drifter pile, so to speak. It just, you're not really getting a power level boost like from that. And the people who have high synergy decks just end up running over those strategies. So we've never found it to be traditionally good idea to come in with the mindset of doing a 5 color deck or anything like that. And we really don't plant anything in here that really incentivizes people to do that in the first place. But
yeah, we did see one guy come in and he drafted a like 4 color reanimator spider spawning deck, which was super cool. It basically leveraged like Chart a Course and Ransack the Lab and the green mill creatures and like took all the different ways to put cards into your graveyard really, really fast. And then was reanimating and blinking Dinrova Horror and doing all this nonsense. They had like 10 creatures in their deck and were somehow able to spider spawning for like 6 every single game on like turn 6, which was really impressive how consistent their deck was at just putting like half their deck into their graveyard and then taking advantage of that.
Yeah, I do love when we get new drafters in and they just draft something off the wall that works. I love that sort of stuff. Something you didn't necessarily intend or seed into your cube. That's always fun.
Yeah, the whole fresh eyes perspective for cube is really fun. And a lot of times these people come in and draft train wrecks, but sometimes we do see those occasional moments of brilliance where they put together a bunch of disparate things to really just make an insane deck.
Hit me with a couple tips. If you had to give a piece of advice or two for new drafters who are approaching maybe cube for the first time, but particularly this Peasant cube, what would your advice be?
I would say the number one thing I would say is commit to your game plan, right? That's the most important thing at Peasant is once you know what your deck is doing, you really want to make your deck good at doing that. And that's not to say don't take generic removal spells or powerful cards, but make sure you're not putting cards that don't fit your deck at all into your deck. And that there's room for creativity there because there's a lot of bleed and overlap between different colors and archetypes, but you don't want to be taking Blood Artist in your blue-black control deck with 7 creatures, right? That's kind of an obvious example, but that's sort of the game plan, right? If you're playing a spells deck, focus on getting the good spells. If you can find spell creatures, that's even better, right? Because now you're adding to the board while contributing to your spells game plan. The other thing is just have a way to mitigate flood. Like scrying is really powerful. Adventures are good. Sacklands are good. Card draw is good if it's in the right spots. Like just make sure you don't run out of stuff to do because so many decks in this cube revolve around having infinite things to do with their mana. And if you run out of stuff, you will lose.
My biggest, like number one piece of advice for pretty much any cube that's built around 2 color pairs and stuff like that is take your lands as premium picks. You need good mana fixed in cube. This isn't retail limited where you're going to play a 9/8 mana base and you might have a dual land. You need the good dual lands, especially the more important it is that you cast spells early in your curve. If you're an aggro Boros deck, you should be treating your red-white untapped dual lands as premium picks behind like maybe the top 2 or 3 best cards in that color pair. And that goes for every color pair. And if you do end up doing the splash thing, There are a lot of colorless cards in this cube that can help you splash, but you do need good mana fixing to compete in cube. Other players will have good mana bases, and they will be casting their spells.
Oh, speaking of Boros, we were looking for something interesting to say, and I will say the most interesting thing in Boros at the moment is Shadowfax. We've only seen it a couple of times.
Yeah.
But that card has been really sweet, and I was playing against an opponent who we were playing a reasonable game of Magic, and then he cast Shadowfax on 5, flipped a Combat Thresher into play, and just murdered me out of nowhere. And he did that like 2 separate games in a row with a bunch of different cards, just put like Shadowfax flipping things into play that had no business being in play. And it was really cool. So that card's been actually pretty impressive when it's come up, and it's an interesting, like unique build around, I think, in that color sphere.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. That card actually ended up doing stuff that I didn't anticipate. Like it never occurred to me putting Combat Thresher into play with Shadowfax is just something you can do. You usually prototype it so it's a smaller creature, but you can free roll it into play and boom, like you're getting hit by Shadowfax and a 3/3 double strike that cantripped on ETB. Like that's pretty gross.
There's a number of silly things you can do with it, yeah.
Yeah, I saw someone put a Hero of the Dunes into play with it to get back another creature so that Shadowfax...
This was game 2 against me after the Combat Thresher game.
Soul of Migration's another one. That's a 7-mana 2/4 that makes 2 1/1 spirits when it enters the battlefield, or when it dies, maybe. I think it's on ETB. So, yeah, you can Shadowfax, attack, put your 2/4 flyer into play, make 2 more 1/1s. Like, it does a lot of good things. I don't think it's problematic because it is a 5-drop. There's a lot of answers to it. It's almost not even a Boros card. It's like something you end up splashing more often than not, or splashing other things for, which is really interesting.
Yeah, but in an archetype that really just wants to be turning things sideways with going wide board, Shadowfax encourages you to like do a little deck design that makes it better, right? So
that's a great example of somebody doing something with your cards that you didn't expect, which is what you want to see as a cube designer, as long as they're not breaking, like they didn't discover like Splinter Twin with Shadowfax or something like that. But Taylor, you up for doing a pack one, pick one here?
Yeah, you would pick like the hardest pack in existence, right? This is a rough one.
I literally refreshed over and over again until I got a pack that had at least 2 cards in each color to talk about. So very briefly to touch on the cards, I won't read every single one of them, but I'll give you an idea of what they do. So for white, we have Recruitment Officer, which is a Savannah Lines that you can pay mana to dig for small creatures, and we have Banishing Light. So let's go through the colors and just narrow down like what your pick would be between the cards in each color, and then we'll talk about the kind of leaders as a whole next to each other. So between Recruitment Officer and Banishing Light, I wouldn't want to first pick either of those cards, but which one do you weigh heavier?
So probably Banishing Light. I don't think Recruitment Officer is very good unless I'm in a dedicated aggressive deck. I think it's an okay card, but Banishing Light, I can at least splash, or, you know, it kills something. It can get rid of a blocker. I don't think either of these cards are very good, though, in terms of first pick quality. They're more like 22nd, 23rd level filler cards.
Yeah, you don't want to first pick a Savannah Lines. You want to know that you're aggro before you do that. So probably Banishing Light there for white. Blue has Consider, the cantrip that can fill up your graveyard, and Rise from the Tides, 6 mana sorcery, make a 2/2 tapped zombie for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. One of the good finishers, one of the good spell-based finishers.
So this is one of those spots where I regularly, if you watch me stream, we'll start up a draft and we'll say, am I trying to spike tonight, or am I playing for fun? Because if I'm playing to play what I want to enjoy, I'm going to take Rise from the Tides because that card is sweet and it builds its own like it's a build around card, right? But if I'm trying to spike, I'll take Consider here. I actually think Consider is really, really good. Blue cantrips are super useful. They're good in all the blue decks, and we just had an entire episode about how good cantrips are. So
yeah, I would snap off Rise from the Tides. In fact, it's hard to imagine there are even other cards in the pack that I would take over Rise from the Tides. It's an easy build around too, is the thing. You just need a bunch of spells and they're there. So Consider, the cantrips are really good, but I don't really ever want to first pick the cantrips, I don't think, unless the pack's kind of weak and I'm just trying to feel out a direction. But black has Fell Stinger. That's the 3 mana 3/2 Death Touch that can exploit a creature. Target player Signs and Bloods, loses 2 life and draw a card. And then there's Nested Shamblers, the 1 mana 1/1 that dies into a 1/1. Unless its power was bigger, then it dies into more 1/1s.
Yeah, I think would be an easy Fell Stinger for me. It's a good defensive creature, draws cards while also stabilizing your board. So I think it's a really solid. I wouldn't be upset to first pick a Fell Stinger. I don't know if I'd be like, jumping for joy, but I'm not upset about it.
Yeah, the cool thing about Fellstinger here is it plays well with Nested Shambler, and that's the only other black card in the pack, so you might even wheel the Shambler and get that back with the Stinger. If you first pick Fellstinger, is there a specific color pair that comes to mind automatically for you?
I want to be in Mardu.
Mardu, black-white. You
Yeah,
could even conceivably play it in black-green, right?
Maybe. I mean, yeah, because you can like sack a Dork in the mid game, and it stabilizes the board reasonably well. It's a 3-drop. I could see it. I usually don't draft Fellstinger high enough in green-black. Usually there's something else I'm more interested in taking, and other people value this card quite highly. But I think you could definitely do that. But I'm definitely looking to play white-black or red-black if I draft Fellstinger as like the ideal, I guess.
Yeah. Red here has Faithless Luden, 1 mana red, draw 2, discard 2 with flashback, and then Voldaren Epicure, that's the 1 mana 1/1 that pings your opponent and makes a blood token.
Between these two cards, I mean, this is like kind of like the recruitment officer banishing light discussion where I don't really want to take either of these cards. I guess I would take Faithless Looting. Maybe I'd take Epicure. I don't know. These are both super weak. I don't even think this is like a banishing light situation where I'm like, okay, I can at least splash this card or whatever. I think these are both cards that you know what deck you want to be in when you draft them, and you don't want to take them early.
Yeah, we're not first picking a red card for sure. Green has a couple good options here. We have Utopia Sprawl, which is the aura that you put on a forest, lets it tap for an additional color in addition to green. Rise from the Ants, which you mentioned earlier, that's 6 mana sorcery, make 2 3/3s and gain 2 life, and then it has flashback for 8 mana. Big Simic card there. And then Kapatek Wrecker, that's the ninja, the green ninja that comes in with a death touch counter, and it can pop an artifact or enchantment if it hits your opponent.
Yeah, so I mean, of all the cards we've looked at in this pack, I'm just going to snap off the Birds of Paradise with haste that can't be interacted with, and if I wheel Rise of the Ants, I'm super excited. If I wheel Kapatek, I'm probably still going to put it in my deck. It's a good card. But yeah, Utopia Sprawl is like miles ahead of every other card we've looked at, I think.
Utopia Sprawl is the best mana accelerant in the format as long as you bias towards green and you make sure you have a bunch of forests, which is even easier when you consider that there's shocklands in this cube, which count as forests as well. So yeah, I think Utopia Sprawl, if you're going to take a green card, you're taking Sprawl here. The mana dorks are irreplaceable, at least the 1 mana ones.
Sprawl even color fixes, which makes it pretty unique because the only other one is Pilgrim, right? The other 1 mana dorks only produce green. Utopia Sprawl being able to fix colors here is really good.
Yeah, exactly. The only gold card in the pack is Soul Herder. What would you think? Would you first pick a Soul Herder?
I mean, I think it's the most fun card in this pack in terms of the kind of stuff you can get into. If you first picked a Soul Herder, I would not blame you. I don't think I would. I think the Johnny in me is like, yeah, Soul Herder's sweet, but also, I'm sorry, I'm not. There's no card in this pack that's going to compete with Utopia Sprawl. It's probably one of the top 10 cards I would take in the entire cube. So
yeah.
If you took Soul Herder, like I don't think I would blame you, and you know what you're getting into, and I could definitely see an incident where like if Utopia Sprawl wasn't in this pack, I might first pick Soul Herder here just off of the upside of the card.
I do think there are people we play with who would have preferences and high enough preferences that they would first pick Soul Herder from this pack. The only other cards in the pack, there's Sigil of Valor, which is a colorless equipment that's a plant for the token deck. You're not first picking that. And then there's a couple lands with the Autonomous Furnace and Hinterland Harbor, which you're not first picking here. So easy Utopia Sprawl for you, it sounds like.
Yep, easy Utopia Sprawl. It's just super good. It's dirt cheap. It's exactly what I want to be doing. It leads me into the archetype I like drafting the most. So yeah.
My preference, actually, I would take Rise from the Tides from this pack. I love being in the blue-based spells decks, whether that ends up being Izzet Control or... Rise from the Tide's not really an Izzet aggro card, but this is also a good Dimir card as well. I do like the blue control decks in the Peasant environment, so I think I would take Rise from the Tides, though. Utopia Sprawl is probably the highest upside. You just run people over if you get the right start with that card. But.
Yeah, I'm not sure what my second pick would be, because I think I said consider over Rise from the Tides, but like I think if I was going to second pick a card here after Utopia Sprawl, it'd probably still be Fellstinger. I think that card's really good. I just am not a fan of first picking like 6 mana cards if I can help it. I think the only time I do that is like I did first pick a Mouth of Sauron a few weeks ago and didn't end up playing it, but I think that card also has some immediate impact. I'm not a huge fan of cards like Rise to the Tide where you have to be stable, because if you aren't in a position where you can you're under any pressure at all, Rise to the Tides, you have to be on a completely controlled board state, right? Like you because all the zombies come into play tapped. So a lot of times you can have situations where your 6 mana card just leaves you dead. It's not what I'm looking for, but I understand why people draft it super highly.
It is a very potent win con that gives your opponent a one-turn opportunity to try and capitalize on your game plan by killing you before you can kill them, which is just how the card plays out. But I do find that if you're able to navigate yourself into a deck that's able to play a bunch of burn, a bunch of black removal, whether you're Dimir or is it, then you can control the board while also building up your Rise from the Tides. And then you also are ideally getting cards like Gandalf's Sanctions or Mouth of Sauron or Tolarian Terror to kind of also have backup win conditions here. So I just like the card.
Yep.
I'm very fond of it from the Shadows over Innistrad Limited and the remaster and stuff like that. So I would take it as a preference pick, recognizing that it might not be the best first pick in this pack.
Yeah, it's definitely up there with Soul Herder as the best payoff in the pack. It's important to recognize Rise from the Tides, while being a mono blue card, is not actually, it's a secret gold card. It just happens to be you can play it in like anywhere in Grixis, really.
Yeah, you wouldn't play this in Azorius or anything like that, but I love starting drafts with six mana cards. It's my favorite thing to do. Actually, my Colossal Sky Turtle is like my favorite pack one pick one. I'll take it every single time, but that's kind of it has more flexibility. You can use it as a bounce spell if you need to, so it's not strictly a 7 mana card. In fact, you probably channel it more often than you actually cast the card.
Yeah, and this is going to end up just being preference. Like, I like that Utopia Sprawl is good to be good in any deck that I play that's green. Like, I can go pretty much any direction from there. So, I wouldn't fault anybody for if you took Soul Herder, Rise to the Tides, Fellstinger, or Utopia Sprawl off personal preference. I think all 4 of those are pretty justifiable picks. I think everything else is a little bit lower in terms of priority. I think Rise to the Ants is super powerful, but I'm never going to pass a green mana dork for an expensive green card.
Yeah, and that is actually a 6-drop that feels like a 6-drop when you cast it. It just gives you more velocity in that Simic ramp deck. Any parting thoughts here for the Peasant Cube before we wrap this bad boy up?
Yeah, come play it. It's really fun. You know, a lot of people have just been, like we said at the beginning of the episode, really preferencing the unrestricted cube, and I get it. It's fun to have big, splashy, powerful spells, but if you like retail limited, this is a kind of environment where you can play out more like a retail limited environment. Like, again, if you play limited, you're going to look through so many of these cards and just be like, man, this card was sweet. And just a lot of fun things to be doing. I really want more people to come play it because it doesn't always fire. And it is my favorite cube that we run. So
it is mine as well. Granted, I do love the unrestricted cube as well, but Peasant's the baby. That's the one we've worked on for 3+ years. There is a huge Peasant audience out there. I think there's actually, like, in terms of just people who tune into Peasant stuff, it feels like there's almost more of an audience for that than unrestricted, but maybe it's the day that we play it on or whatever where people aren't actually coming to play it, and we want to test things out more. We want to get more opinions from the community at large. So come play it.
If you like Peasant, look, get some wild cards to get your rares. The uncommons will flow to you, the commons will flow to you, and come yell at us about what day we need to have the Peasant Cube on so that we can have 8, 10, 12 people come play.
With all that being said, thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank. What is this podcast called? The Jank Tank Podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback so that we can keep making the best cubes that we possibly can for the community. Great place to hang out with like-minded individuals. Talk about cube, retail limited, all things Magic. You can hear Teld talk about how much Wilds of Eldraine sucks while I'm trying to defend it. We draft the unrestricted cube on Sundays at 7:30 Eastern. The Peasant Cube that we've been talking about here today takes place on Wednesday nights at 7:30 Eastern, though sometimes we use that Wednesday slot for specialty cubes or community cubes and stuff like that. You can find links to the Discord wherever you're listening to this podcast. Also, check out Twitter at Jank Diver Gaming, or X, or whatever you want to call it, before Muskie Boy starts charging us for basic subscriptions and we move to some other platform. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Twitch. What is your name? It's not Twitch. Teld. You can find Teld streaming on Twitch at twitch.tv/TeldTalks, TELD Talks. And that's going to go ahead and do it. Thanks for hanging out. Our next episode will be a comparison of cube draft-in versus retail limited draft-in. We'll see you then. I got something for you here today as soon as I find it. Okay. Yeah, here we go. So I know you're a big fan of the Wilds of Eldraine Candyland food creatures, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like the Scream Puff and the Minstrosity and stuff like that. So I thought I would take a little bit of time to create my own and get you to just kind of give me an idea of what you think about my own create my own candy creatures here. I've got 6 or 7 of them for you here.
6 or 7? Jesus. Okay.
It'll be quick. I will go ahead and blast through these. So the first one, it's 2 and a green for an instant, destroy target permanent. Its opponent makes a food token. I'm calling this one Yeast Within. You see where I'm going with these?
Yeah, I see.
So, we've also got a creature here. 1 in a green. It's star power and it's star toughness +1. So kind of like a Goyf. The star is equal to the number of foods in your graveyard. And this card's called Parmagoyf.
wait, the food's in your graveyard?
Yeah. I mean, it had to be a Goyf. Like, I don't know. You get your candy trail in the graveyard. You get your ginger bread in the
fair
graveyard.
enough.
That's Parmagoyf. Next up, this is basically the same thing as Ravenous Chupacabra. 2 BB, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, destroy creature. But this is Ravenous Chalupacabra, which I can't take a lot of credit for that one. I'm sure that joke has been made before. Chris would love this one. I know he's a big fan of this counter spell. 1 in a blue instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 2 mana. So kind of like a Quench, right? But it has food casualty. So you can sacrifice a food to copy it.
Is it called Stench?
No. It's called Cake Disappear.
Oh, that's even better. Oh, goodness.
Yeah. So you sacrifice the food, the cake goes away. That's a good one. 4 black, 6/6 Death Touch. When it ETBs or attacks, you create 2 food tokens. Might sound really familiar. This one's Gravy Titan. And then, we got a red mana for a 1/1 creature. It taps for red mana, and you can sacrifice 2 foods to deal 2 damage to any creature. Calling this one Grim Flavomancer.
Yeah, that's cute.
And then, last one here. This is my favorite one. So, Lord of the Rings inspired card here. It's a 1/1 flash for 1 and a black. When it ETBs or when your opponent draws an extra card, you deal a damage and you amass food.
We're playing Orcish Dough Masters, right?
Oh, man, that's good. No, this is Orcish Dough Masters. This is Porkish Bow Masters. Although Porkish Dough Masters would have been fantastic. That's all I got. I thought I would submit these to Wizards and see if they'll put me on the next Eldraine.
Oh, you're definitely getting invited to the creative team. They're hiring you on the spot. Oh, goodness.
I was just on a walk with my kid one day, and I was like, in my head for no reason, it was like, what if it was Yeast Within instead of Beast Within? What about that? And I was like, how many more of these can I come up with? Really went downhill after Yeast Within.
Oh, Lord. Yeah, that's I wasn't prepared. I thought I was prepared for like something actually like created cards, and it just dropped Yeast Within on me, and it's like, all right, that's
yeah, and it's all downhill from there.
Big Mamma Jamma finisher.
Something graveyard deck.